more violent? Fisher Tiger's rebellion to free the slaves from the celestial dragons, or the oppressive system that made his uprising necessary in the first place? Like, sure, Fisher Tiger's actions were textbook definition violent. You know, like the whole climbing the red line thing with his bare hands and leading a full-scale revolt. Not gonna lie, pretty freaking cool. Pretty freaking cool. But the real violence was done long before his revolution, through a system that dehumanized and broke him, leaving scars deeper than any physical violence ever could. And that is the quiet, insidious violence of systems, a theme that's as true in the real world as it is in One Piece. And it makes you ask a question. What does violence really mean? Like, what's more violent? Someone killing a guard of a prison that enslaves people, or the actions of a prison guard who maybe hasn't killed someone, but who upholds the system itself? Or even further, an administrator who files paperwork to ensure that that prison continues to operate. Or, like, here's an even more relevant example from the time that I'm recording this. What's more violent? Being the CEO of a healthcare company that's responsible for thousands of medical deaths, or killing that person? Well, I just got back from Japan and I was rereading the Fishman Island arc, and it made me think about how we define that word. Violence. And it got me thinking about one of my favorite authors, and one of the sharpest minds to ever analyze oppressive systems, Frantz Fanon. Fanon once said that violence is man recreating himself. And when you look at our favorite anime through this lens, One Piece is pretty insightful at revealing these hidden natures of violence, and why it's crucial for us to understand these different types of violence as we strive to overcome oppression in our own lives.
Fair warning! I won't go down easily! You'll have to kill me! Arrogant
Way back in that intro, you might remember that I mentioned Fisher Tiger. You know, Fishman Jesus who climbed the red line with his bare hands to free the slaves from the celestial dragons. And to me, his rebellion is one of the most striking moments in One Piece. But it's also incredibly, incredibly tragic. The moral of his story isn't just that he fought back against an obviously messed up system. It's that he died refusing a human blood transfusion, even though it would have saved him. And honestly, reading it, it's kind of ridiculous. It's like, why'd you do that, man? But it's because the system that enslaved him didn't just harm his body, it poisoned his mind. It dehumanized him, no pun intended, and it turned his pain into hatred, even when his own life was on the line. And this echoes the ideas of Frantz Fanon, who showed that systematic violence doesn't just harm people physically, it reshapes how they see themselves and their oppressors. The enslaved internalize oppression, and even their resistance is shaped by the system's dehumanizing logic. Fisher Tiger's refusal of human blood wasn't just personal. It was the legacy of a system designed to divide and degrade.
大変だろう元帥
戦国さん黙っときんさいや範囲巨人が
Fanon once wrote that the colonized man is an envious man. He explained that systematic violence doesn't just harm through direct action. It erodes identity, community, and even hope. And Fisher Tiger's story is a vivid representation of it. He didn't just hate humans because they enslaved him. He hated them because by the end of his life, the system made him believe that there could never be trust or equality. And this kind of violence, the quiet, systematic kind, is all over One Piece. Like, pull back from the experience of Fisher Tiger and think about the Fishmen as a whole. It's not just the brutality of the celestial dragons. It's the laws, it's the culture, and it's like the unspoken rules that they treat fishmen as lesser beings. The violence is baked into the system. And Fanon believed that when oppression becomes this ingrained, resistance isn't just an option, it's inevitable. It's a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And as we see the backstory, you see that Fisher Tiger's rebellion isn't random. It was the natural result of systematic violence pushing him and his people to their breaking point. And there are so many good examples in One Piece, but we don't have the time to go over all of them, but I think that Ohara is another great one. It really shows the systematic nature of these kinds of violence. Because the world government didn't unleash that buster call because they wanted to, it wasn't on a whim. It happened because the system demanded it. The scholars were a threat to the status quo, so the system erased them. And Fanon talked about how colonial powers justify this violence because of logic and justice, which should sound familiar. They claim that they're protecting order even as they're destroying lives. Like, we watch the world government wipe out Ohara not with rage, but with like cold bureaucracy. Because they didn't need to feel guilty, it was all in the name of justice. And when someone stands up and punches back like Luffy does, or even just survives like Robin did, they're deemed as a terrorist. They're called violent, and that violence is said to be dangerous. And that's what makes systematic violence so terrifying. It's not a fair fight. In fact, it doesn't even really look like a fight. It looks like laws, orders, and policies. And to me, it's so much more violent than anyone who would punch back, just because of the way it makes us think about this concept of violence itself.
No.
So I've been throwing this word violence around a lot. What the hell does it actually mean? Because it's easy to picture violence as something physical, like throwing punches or getting someone with a sword, slashing someone with a sword, or razing cities to the ground. But the truth is that violence wears a lot of faces, and a lot of them aren't loud or obvious at all. There's direct violence, the stuff that you see in fights or wars, which is immediate and visceral and usually easy to label as right or wrong. And then there's systematic violence, the kind that sometimes doesn't look like violence at all because it's baked into the rules we're conditioned for. When people are crushed under poverty or denied healthcare or treated as less than because of their race, class, or background, all that good stuff. That's systematic violence. And here's the thing. The more that people feel like the system can or will work for them, the less likely they are to turn to direct violence. Courts, elections, and laws provide a sense of fairness, or at least the illusion of fairness. These are things that in society say that, if you work within the system, you can fix or change the system. And generally, as long as people believe that that's true, they will choose the peaceful route. But when people see that that's not real and that hope disappears, that's when things get messy. Because when you really start thinking about it, the morality of violence and the morality of things like revolution, it's not nearly as clear cut as we want it to be. Unfortunately, things in life just aren't black and white. Like, I know I've talked about him a lot, but if you go back to Fisher Tiger, would you say it was wrong for him to burn down Mariejois and free the slaves? I mean, the system certainly thought so. They branded him as a criminal and a terrorist. But truthfully, what other options did he have? The system never really offered him a path to true justice. His fists were never his first choice, they were just his last resort. And One Piece is a great example of this, but this is not just an anime trope. It's real life. History shows us this exact same pattern. As long as people feel like there's a real shot at justice, whether it's through voting or the courts or protesting, they're most likely going to stick with non-violent options. People don't want violence in their day-to-day life, but when those systems fail, or worse, when they actively reinforce injustice, support for violence resistance grows. Think about some classic examples, like the French or Russian revolutions, or the Algerian revolution like Fanon wrote about. All of them were fueled by systems so deeply unfair that people had no faith in reforms. Even in the United States, FDR's New Deal wasn't just about economic reform. It was about giving people hope, because by creating programs that addressed inequality, FDR didn't just stabilize the economy, he stopped the country from unraveling into outright revolt. And on the flip side of that, in the United States, think about the rise of outlaw folk heroes like the United Healthcare CEO Assassin. People aren't celebrating him because they love chaos and violence. They're celebrating him because people don't see any other way to push back against our system. In a fair, compassionate society, a figure like him wouldn't exist. But in a cruel, unjust system, he becomes a symbol of hope. When violence breaks out, it's easy to point fingers at the people throwing punches or lighting the flames. But the real question to me is always, who built the kindling? Who left people so powerless and so hopeless that they did not see another way forward? And that's the kind of violence we're talking about here. The kind that doesn't just break bones, but breaks spirits. And it brings us right back to One Piece, where the entire story, the entire manga is about blurring these lines. Fisher Tiger's revolution wasn't about chaos for chaos's sake. It was a desperate response in a world that gave him no other options. And to me, that's why his story feels so real, even though he's half man, half fish, because it reflects a lot of the same dynamics that we see in our world today. Fanon always believed that liberation is about much more than just overthrowing the oppressors. It's about reclaiming humanity and breaking the cycle of dehumanization. And that's what Fisher Tiger's fight and Luffy's journey are all about to me. When Luffy punches a celestial dragon, it's not just a cathartic moment, it's symbolic. Like, he's not just fighting one villain, he's rejecting the entire system that lets people like the celestial dragons even exist. And importantly, he's offering an alternative, a world built on freedom and not oppression. And that's why people like the eyebrow assassin become folk heroes. They reject systems and they offer alternatives. Yes, absolutely, in a way that's chaotic and violent. But the question is the response more violent than the system that inspired? Like, as bystanders, what's our moral obligation here? Are we really supposed to mourn the death of a CEO whose company is responsible for like 50,000 medical deaths a year? Personally, I just can't find it in myself, because I know way too many people who've suffered at the hands of that system and that company specifically. Because what makes One Piece so timeless is how it connects these big ideas to what feel like real personal stories. Fisher Tiger, the Scholars of Ohara, I mean, even Luffy, these are individuals who are shaped by the systems around them. And their stories remind us that the most dangerous violence often isn't the loudest. It's the kind that makes oppression feel normal. It's the kind that convinces people that there's no point in fighting back. And I think that's what Fanon spent his whole life trying to explain. And it's what One Piece captures so beautifully. That violence isn't always about fists and guns. It's in the laws and the systems and the beliefs that make people suffer. And fighting it takes way more than just strength. It takes hope and courage and a willingness to imagine a better world. Like, we know in One Piece that Luffy doesn't just fight for himself. He fights for the Fisher Tigers and the Scholars of Ohara and everyone who's been crushed by the system. Like, whether he means to or not, that's who he fights for. And to me, that's why his story resonates so deeply. Because in a world that feels way too big to change, Luffy always reminds us that the fight's worth it.